This episode is sponsored by CuriosityStream. More on a free 30-day trial at the end of the video.
Hey, Cypher here. Have you ever read Plato's Symposium? It's basically Plato's take on love. You know, basically the first philosophical discussion of what that is in human history. If you have read it, then you might have been surprised by the repeated hand-waving away of heterosexuality like it's of secondary importance. As one of the interlocutors say, "They who are a section of the male follow the male, and while they are young, being slices of the original man, they hang about men and embrace them, and they are themselves the best of boys and youths, because they have the most manly nature." If that makes you rethink everything that you know about sexuality, good, because human sexuality is a lot more weird when you look at the history of it than you would ever believe. Just like any abstract category, it is a social construct. Yes, sexuality. It's a strange beast. I've mentioned many times on the channel that any abstract category, including race, class, and gender, are social constructs, and every time I do, there's always some confused and often a lot of hateful comments in response to that statement. But this is actually one of the clear lessons of history. Nearly every way we've thought of classifying people has been constructed, meaning every category has a history to it, and a consequence resulting from that history. And when it comes to human sexuality, the history of it clearly shows that there is no such thing as perfectly natural. There may be such a thing as a natural human sexuality, but there are so many centuries of history layered on top of it that we have no way of knowing what is natural or not.
Yeah, Cypher, some categories do seem perfectly normalized, like there being two genders. We think that challenging the gender binary is a new thing, but actually it's very old. Many different cultures in the past and even today have had extremely different concepts as to what gender actually is. But to learn how that works, you're going to have to come over to my channel.
That was Tristan from Step Back History, and he's basically doing the same thing I am with this episode, but instead of human sexuality, he's doing the same thing with gender. So be sure to go check that out. Now to get started, sexuality is different from gender, but academia lumps sexuality into the category of gender when they're talking about like gender studies and that, because, well, a lot of academics are just not very imaginative. Which is kind of sad, because, you know, talking about sexuality, there's a lot of things to imagine, right? Plus, academia has really only started coming to terms with this subject in recent decades. But going back a couple millennia, Plato was clearly dealing with a completely different form of sexuality back in the 4th or 5th century BC. Which is when that symposium supposedly took place. They're talking about what is sometimes called homosexuality, but to be more specific, it's actually called pederasty. And pederasty and homosexuality are not the same thing. If you recoil in disgust at even the mere mention of that word, that's a good thing. We don't think boys can give consent, but that's actually a modern notion. At the time, people were considered to be able to give consent as soon as they hit puberty. And many of these cases were actually well into adulthood, but normally there was a significant age difference. Whether it be a 30-year-old with a 16-year-old, or a 50-year-old with a 25-year-old. Plato was famously entangled with a boy named Dion when that boy was 16, and continued well into that boy's adulthood. Actually, he wrote sonnets for the kid, saying, "O Dion, whose love once maddened the heart within this breast." This was considered normal for centuries, not only in Greece, but throughout the Roman Empire too. Can you imagine a world where pederasty was considered the status quo? It's difficult to fathom as a modern person. And that's the crux of this discussion. There is no such thing as natural sexuality, at least that we can find. As one historian said, there is no shortage of documents with which to study discourses of non-normative sexuality. So as with any video like this, I am not trying to have an exhaustive discussion of every single example that I could possibly find. Rather, I am trying to give just enough to show that sexuality is a social construct. Throughout history, we can find what we call homosexuality was outlawed in numerous states, but in order for it to be outlawed, it had to exist. Anti-sodomy laws go back as far as the Assyrian Empire, at least that we can find. Those guys said, if a man has intercourse with his brother in arms, they shall turn him into a eunuch. Yeah, Bronze Age empires weren't known for their subtlety. In the United States, there's actually still states that have anti-sodomy laws on the books, though Lawrence v. Texas made those unconstitutional in 2003. But because of such laws, we know of numerous people's sexual proclivities, which include the whole pantheon of queer orientation, and has many very famous people in it. These include Lord Byron, Oscar Wilde, Tchaikovsky, Billie Holiday, John Maynard Keynes, and Alan Turing, just to name a few. And this shows that there were people always pushing against the status quo. Now, I do have to say that people like to apply these modern definitions backwards, like saying that, oh look, this one famous guy must have been gay. But that's not really understanding how these categories got constructed. Then again, there were plenty of people who were crossing these sexual boundaries, at least in secret. As historians, when we find environments that have a bunch of people of the same gender, typically we will find relationships that would currently be called homosexual. In fact, oftentimes they seem so commonplace that sodomy just seemed like an alternative to heterosexuality. For instance, the Ottoman Empire outlawed sodomy, and yet we could find numerous instances of people citing male-on-male prostitution as a huge problem, which included among the Janissaries, who were Christian slave soldiers. For 19th century sailors, there was an entire euphemism for the trade in sexual intercourse among themselves. It was called the boom cover trade. And we can find that attitude duplicated during the California Gold Rush using literally the same terminology. Another prominent example that everyone's heard of is lesbian nuns, and actually the record seems to verify that. Judith Brown says, convents were notorious for their loose moral standards and for their sexual license, which is not surprising because they were less often the home of women with a strong religious vocation than warehouses for the discarded women of middle class and patrician families. Now there's a lot of debate as to how much these lesbians inside of convents reflected the world outside of them. But the fact remains that women turned to women for sexual gratification even when they were supposedly married to Jesus. For homosexuality to be a common alternative to heterosexuality, there has to be some fluidity in these categories. They can be shaped over time. Then there's the realm of domesticity. Here is where the realms of sexuality and gender tend to blend together because it's, the place where sexual orientation and gender identity meld with society. What's considered women's work has changed drastically over time. It might be utterly commonplace for men to cook in one culture and then in another for it to be almost prohibited. When horses were introduced onto the American Great Plains by the Spanish, mostly accidentally actually, Great Plains Indian culture changed significantly and women were increasingly relegated to work that they hadn't done before, and men increasingly focused on hunting and fighting. But there were always people who were crossing that boundary, often as a very clear sign of sexual orientation. You see, they signaled their sexuality by whether or not they were more domestic. Returning to the California Gold Rush, people's journals are littered with references to men having to take on more and more domestic jobs, and their want for women. But the fact that there weren't that many women in the diggings meant that men had to take on more and more of what they considered women's work. And so in return, many of them went to that boom cover trade to fulfill their sexual desires. Our stark divide of separate spheres is something that had to be constructed over time, and then only recently people started naturalizing it as though it's always been that way. As Mary Poovey says, unequal privilege of domains are codified by law and then naturalized by repetition. Probably the most stark example of this is the very name that we gave our own animal kingdom: mammals. When Carl Linnaeus was creating the modern form of taxonomy, which science still uses today, he of course had to give names to the various animal kingdoms. At the time that Linnaeus was doing this, there was a craze sweeping Europe that was emphasizing mothers breastfeeding their own childs, rather than wet nurses and whatnot. And people like Rousseau pushed it so hard that he wrote it into his philosophy. So what did Linnaeus coin as our animal kingdom's name? That's right, he named us mammals because mammaries. He was trying to push for breastfeeding. Yeah, even the name mammals is actually political. It had to be built over time, and it's written into the very words that we consider scientific today. But well into the 19th century, these were still fluid categories. People were able to slip between womanhood, sodomy, and manliness with ease. But some of these terms were designed to alienate people, because for instance, sodomy became homosexuality in the 19th century. As Michel Foucault says, homosexuality appeared as one of the forms of sexuality when it was transposed from the practice of sodomy onto a kind of interior androgyny, a hermaphrodism of the soul. The sodomite had to be a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species. So we actually used to think of sodomy as a completely different thing from homosexuality today. The splitting off of these things from heterosexuality is only a 19th century invention. The spectrum of queer identities represented in this giant list of things had to be created, and they were created by differentiating heterosexuality as if it were a completely different species, something that we can call scientific sexism. When mental disorders were codified through the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, homosexuality was one of those disorders. That didn't get removed until 1974, yet the legacy remains. We cannot completely do away with these categories because we've built too much upon them. Throughout the 20th century, queer identity changed and differentiated itself, especially once it became its own civil rights movement. I can't go into too much detail because this episode is already too long as it is, but the LGBT civil rights movement has allowed people to express themselves in new and different ways. Though the Stonewall riot was not the beginning as is often depicted, especially considering there were civil rights workers at that bar when it was raided. But the riot was the popularization of the movement. Gay pride parades happened specifically on the anniversary of that riot, and they have come to symbolize the movement as a whole. Evolving alongside the LGBT movement are their very identities. We should never lose sight of the fact that LGBT identity was created specifically to alienate them from heterosexuality. This is the legacy of centuries of change. History shows us that social categories are not natural and they have very real consequences from their creation. The people who are going to be saying, "Keep politics out of my history,"
This is the sonorous war cry of a very angry frog.
well, they're actually kind of guilty of repressing these identities by simply saying that. And even worse, they're hypocrites. As Joan Scott said, Those who would write politics out of professional life misunderstand the process by which all knowledge, including knowledge of history, has been produced.
He says it's an outrage.
Sexuality is not a static thing. It has changed and morphed over time. Now, I've oversimplified a lot here for the sake of brevity, and if you're interested, all my sources are listed in the description or in the pinned comment. But before you go, be sure to check out Stepback's video as well. Also, I'm pretty sure this is getting demonetized because there's a whole lot of the no-no words in here.
Luckily, CuriosityStream sponsored this episode. They've really helped the channel out with these constant problems of demonetization and suppression. Plus, their service is really useful. You can't find many of the documentaries on CuriosityStream anywhere else. They are an online documentary streaming platform. There's a profusion of content for almost anything you'd like. And if you click the link in the description below, you get a 30-day free trial to stream anything on their platform. It's not just history either, though obviously that's what I prefer, but if you want to watch something on the sciences or social studies, there's plenty out there for you. So go check them out. And thank you, CuriosityStream, for sponsoring the channel.